Overthrow of the Qajar dynasty, and the capture of the Shah throne by Reza Khan. The suppression of the national liberation movement, Reza Khan gradually concentrated both military and civil power in his hands. In order to subjugate all the military forces of Iran, he undertook the liquidation of various military units and began to create an Iranian army with a single system of organization. It should be noted that these reorganizations were carried out according to plans drawn up by British officers on the basis of the Anglo-Iranian Agreement of 1919. In the autumn of 1921, the Corps of South Persian Riflemen created by the British was abolished. Then the Swedish officers from the gendarmerie were dismissed, which was transferred to the jurisdiction of the War Ministry. In January 1922, an order was issued to liquidate all the various military units, Cossacks, gendarmes, Shah'S, etc., and to organize a single, centralized and subordinate army, that is, Reza Khan. The whole of Iran was divided into 6 military districts. 1. Northwestern, with a center in Tabriz. 2. Northern, with a center in Rasht. 3. Eastern, with a center in Mashhad. 4. Western, with a center in Hamadan. 5. Central, with a center in Tehran, and 6. South, with a center in Isfahan. In each district, divisions were organized, headed by officers subordinate to Reza Khan. Gradually, the divisional commanders began to interfere in the affairs of the civil administration. Along with civil governors, military governors appeared, who were subordinate to Reza Khan and often enjoyed no less influence than civil governors. In order to ensure regular payment of the army salary, Reza Khan reserved some government revenues, such as indirect taxes, for the army. At the beginning of 1922, he took over the management of indirect taxes. Then the command of the divisions was entrusted with the collection of taxes from the population. Thus, Reza Khan actually took over not only military power, but also finances. During subsequent cabinet changes, Reza Khan invariably remained the Minister of War. Relying on military force, he often acted without regard for the opinion of the cabinet of ministers. So already from 1922, Reza Khan began to turn into the actual dictator of Iran. The English, with whom he was connected, helped him in this. They did this with the expectation that they would be able to use Reza Khan in the future to fight against the influence of Soviet Russia in Iran, as well as to suppress the national liberation movement in the country. The British imperialists subsequently managed to use Reza Khan and force him to serve these purposes. But Reza Khan was not a simple English agent acting blindly at the behest of the British. In a number of cases, especially in the first years of his de facto rule over Iran, he carried out activities that offended the interests of the British in Iran. So, for example, at the request of Reza Khan in 1921, British military instructors were removed from the Cossack division, and the Corps of South Persian Riflemen created by the British was liquidated. In 1921, under pressure and at the insistence of the Soviet government, which, on the basis of the Soviet-Iranian Treaty of 1921, demanded the evacuation of British troops, the British were forced to evacuate their troops from Iran, with the exception of garrisons in the southern Iranian ports and on the islands of the Persian Gulf. Under the pressure of the growth of the national liberation movement in the countries of the East, Turkey, Afghanistan, and the growing prestige of Soviet Russia, the British were forced to satisfy these demands. They also proceeded from the need to create for Reza Khan the aura of a national Iranian figure, which would give them the opportunity to use Reza Khan with great success in the fight against Soviet Russia and to stifle the democratic movement in the country. The British, fighting for the subordination of Reza Khan to their influence, used not only his aspirations for dictatorial power and hatred for the revolutionary movement, but also resorted to various methods of pressure on him, organization of separatist actions of feudal khans against Reza Khan, etc. Relying on the troops he created, Reza Khan began to pursue a policy of centralizing the country and subordinating large semi-independent feudal lords, especially khans of nomadic tribes. This policy met with active resistance from the latter. In a number of regions, they openly, with weapons in their hands, opposed Riza Khan and the centralization carried out by him. In 1922 to 1924. In the north, west and south of Iran, uprisings broke out repeatedly against the central Iranian government. The struggle against the centralization policy of Riza Khan in the north was waged by the Khan of Markin, as well as the Shah 7, Talashinsky and Kalkal Khans. In the west by the Kurds led by Smitko, in the southwest by the Arab tribes led by Sheikh Khazal, and in the south by the Kashkai, Bakhshia and Lur Khans. In an effort to weaken Iran and put pressure on Riza Khan, the British supported many of these separatist actions of the Khans against the central Iranian government. The British supplied the Khans with money and weapons, and sometimes their uprisings were organized by English agents. First of all, Riza Khan attacked the Khans of northern Iran with his troops. During 1922 to 1923, he subjugated the Shah 7, Talish, Kalkal and Markin Khans. Cruel reprisals were carried out over the recalcitrant Khans. Many of them were hanged. Their property was confiscated, and the lion's share of it was taken by Riza Khan himself, and the rest by his officers. Measures were taken to disarm the tribes. In the middle of 1922, an uprising began in Kurdistan, led by Smitko. The Kurds put forward the slogan of creating an autonomous, and even independent Kurdistan. The uprising involved the broad masses of Kurds, who fought for the liberation from the power of the Iranian oppressors. In essence, this uprising was a national liberation uprising. But some Kurdish Khans tried to use it to strengthen their power over the Kurdish tribes. The British also sought to use this Kurdish movement to their advantage. Their plan included the creation of a buffer, independent Kurdistan in the territories of Iran, Turkey and Iraq, inhabited by Kurds, to put pressure on both Turkey and Iran, and on Soviet Russia. In August 1922, the troops of Riza Khan defeated the Kurdish detachments and occupied Chekrik Kale, the residence of Smitko. In 1922, in Khuzestan, with the participation of British agents, the so-called Union of Southern Tribes was created, headed by Sheikh Mohammad, now Khorramshahr, Khazal. Sheikh Khazal and the Union of Southern Tribes, at the instigation of the British, carried out propaganda for the creation of an independent Arabistan. The British sought under the guise of independent Arabistan to completely seize the southwestern oil-bearing regions of Iran. Riza Khan's attempt to put an end to the Union of Southern Tribes and Sheikh Khazal in 1922 failed. The detachment sent by Riza Khan to Khuzestan was surrounded and disarmed by the Bakhtiyars. Riza Khan was forced to temporarily abandon the idea of subordinating Khazal. In 1923, Riza Khan defeated the Luristan Khans. In December of the same year, the center of Luristan Khorramabad was occupied. Part of the Lurs were resettled to the northeast of Iran, to Khorasan. Fighting for the centralization of Iran in order to spread his power against the separatism of the Khans, Riza Khan continued to brutally crack down on the democratic movement. The outbreaks of peasant uprisings that took place in Gilan and Khorasan after the defeat of the National Liberation Movement in Gilan and the uprising of Muhammad Taghi Khan were suppressed with extraordinary cruelty. Trade unions and the labor movement were also persecuted. The newspapers of the trade unions Karkakat, Kar and Ektasade Iran were closed down. The government tried through its agents to organize its own trade unions of the Zubatov type. But the workers realized that this was a government trap and did not join these trade unions. Then, to combat the labor movement in Tehran, the Union of Entrepreneurs was created. Relying on this alliance, the government tried to disintegrate the workers' organizations and crush the democratic movement. These measures against the peasant and labor movement strengthened the authority of Riza Khan among the landlord bourgeois circles, which were his social support. In October 1923, Ahmed Shah, who returned from abroad, was forced to appoint Riza Khan as prime minister. After that, Ahmed Shah, under pressure from Riza Khan, was again forced to go abroad. Leaving Iran, the Shah appointed his brother as regent, from whom Riza Khan took away a subscription with an obligation not to interfere in state affairs. Already at that time, the Qajars were actually deprived of power in Iran, which was almost solely ruled by Reza Khan. At the direction of Reza Khan, who sought to consolidate his popularity among the bourgeois circles, a number of bills were developed, drafts of the criminal and commercial codes. A bill on the introduction of universal military service, a bill on the size and procedure for levying taxes on land, livestock, trade turnover and etc., which met the interests of the landowners and the bourgeoisie. The Ministry of Public Works was developing a project for the construction of the railway. In the early 1920s, US imperialism made a new attempt to penetrate Iran and bring it under its influence. At the invitation of the Iranian government, financial advisor Millspo arrived in Iran in 1922 from America, under the pretext of reorganizing the financial system. The Millspo mission, like the Schuster mission in 1911, was not a private undertaking. Millspo was sent to Iran by American capitalist companies and the U.S. State Department to ensure the penetration of U.S. imperialism into Iran and pave the way for the enslavement of Iran. Especially American capitalists were interested in oil in the north of Iran. They sought, with the help of Millspo, to seize it in their hands. Millspo was closely associated with American oil companies. Before leaving for Iran, he was in charge of the oil division of the U.S. State Department. The invitation of the Millspo mission, which was in Iran from 1922 to 1927, was facilitated by Qajar Sultan. During his tenure as Prime Minister, Qajar contributed in every possible way to the penetration of U.S. imperialism into Iran. In particular, in violation of Article 13 of the Soviet-Iranian Treaty in 1921, the Qajar government tried to grant American oil companies concessions to exploit oil in northern Iran. Similar concessions already in 1921 and 1923 were provided to the American companies Standard Oil and Sinclair. However, these attempts by U.S. imperialism to seize oil in the north of Iran did not lead to the desired results at that time. The oil concessions granted to the Americans were cancelled as a result of the protests of the USSR. These American concessions were also hindered by the British, who sought to maintain the monopoly position of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in Iran. As for Qajar's position with regard to Soviet Russia, Qajar prevented the development of Soviet-Iranian relations in every possible way. During Qajar's tenure as Prime Minister, the Iranian Majlis dragged on for almost a year with the ratification of the Soviet-Iranian Treaty of 1921. Millspo's mission took anti-Soviet positions. Millspo tried in every possible way to disrupt the development of Soviet-Iranian relations, and in particular, Soviet-Iranian trade. Millspo's activities brought great harm to the economy and independence of Iran. Under pressure from the British and Americans, the Iranian Majlis refused to approve the Soviet-Iranian trade agreement signed in 1924, which established the unlicensed import of Iranian goods to the USSR and Soviet goods to Iran, beneficial for Iran. But the British and American imperialists and the enemies of the USSR in Iran still failed to disrupt the development of Soviet-Iranian economic relations vital for Iran. The economic devastation caused by the British rule and the severance of trade ties with Soviet Russia caused strong dissatisfaction among a significant part of the landlords and merchants, who demanded the establishment of Soviet-Iranian trade. This forced Reza Khan to expand the Soviet-Iranian trade. To promote the development of Soviet-Iranian trade, mixed Soviet-Iranian societies were founded, Shah'S, Rusbasaha, Persklopok, Persasneft, and others. Rusbasbank was founded to finance Soviet-Iranian trade. These measures led to a significant increase in trade and to the revival of the economic life of Iran. The Soviet-Iranian society Persklopok played a big role in the development of cotton growing in Iran. It contributed to the introduction of new valuable varieties of cotton seeds. Variety testing plots and meteorological stations were organized. As a result, cotton growing in Iran began to recover. A great deal of work on the restoration of sericulture in Gilan and Mazandaran was done by the Soviet-Iranian Persian Silk Society. The resumption of Soviet-Iranian trade had a beneficial effect on the restoration of other branches of the Iranian economy, which had previously been in a state of stagnation and decline for a long time as a result of the dominance of the British in Iran and the rupture of trade ties with Russia. Exports from Iran began to grow, prices for Iranian goods rose, and prices for goods imported into Iran fell. The activation of the trade balance meant an improvement in the financial situation of the country. Thus, the restoration of trade relations between Iran and Soviet Russia and the friendly policy of the Soviet government towards Iran contributed to the rise and development of the country's economy. Reza Khan used the revival of economic life to strengthen his authority and influence. Under the leadership of Reza Khan, the landowner bourgeois party, Tajdid, Renewal, was formed. In the elections to the Fifth Majlis, Reza Khan and his protégés exerted all kinds of pressure on the voters, and they managed to win over a large number of their supporters. The Tajdid faction was the strongest in the Fifth Majlis. As early as the end of 1923, a campaign began in Iran to overthrow the Qajar dynasty and the monarchical system in general and to establish a republican regime. Reza Khan first tried to use the plan to establish a republic in Iran, hoping in this way to finally remove the Qajar dynasty from power and consolidate his power, becoming the president of the republic, following the example of Kemal Ataturk. The campaign for the republic especially intensified after it became known about the connections of Ahmed Shah with the leader of the Union of Southern Tribes, Sheikh Qajar. But the propaganda of the republican system was met with hostility by the feudal aristocracy and the clergy, who enjoyed even greater influence in Iran. The clerical opposition to the republican movement was led by the well-known clergyman Modaz. At the same time, agitation for the republic contributed to a new upsurge in the political activity of the masses. Fear of a possible new wave of the revolutionary movement, as well as the fear of finally restoring the clergy and all supporters of the monarchy against themselves, forced Reza Khan to abandon the republican plan to assert his power. On March 31, 1924, Reza Khan, as Prime Minister, issued a declaration in which he declared that he had always striven to ensure the prosperity of Islam and to fully protect the positions of the clergy, and recommended that the people leave the idea of a republic and instead apply all their efforts and cares to remove obstacles from the path of reform and progress of the state and to support it in the implementation of the sacred goal of strengthening the foundations of faith, the independence of the state, and national power. In 1924, Sheikh Qajar again spoke out against Reza Khan, establishing contact both with Ahmed Shah and with the Berkshire and Sumler Khans. He appealed to the higher clergy with a request to sanction the declaration of war against the government of Reza Khan, which he called the godless government. In September 1924, Sheikh Qajar sent a telegram to the envoys of foreign states and the Majlis in Tehran, in which Reza Khan was declared a usurper and usurper of state power in Persia. He called for the protection of His Majesty the Shah's beloved. Again, at the instigation of the British, talk about the creation of an independent Arabistan intensified. In response to this, Reza Khan, who by that time had subjugated the recalcitrant Khans in other regions and had already occupied some cities in southwestern Iran with his troops, sent his main forces against Sheikh Qajar. The Majlis declared Qajar and his associates to be rebels and traitors. In December 1924, as a result of the mediation of the British, who by that time had already agreed with Reza Khan on a very important issue for them, on creating conditions for expanding the activities of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which plundered the natural resources of Iran, Sheikh Qajar surrendered to Reza Khan and was sent to Tehran. Government troops were sent to Khuzestan. At the end of 1924, a new uprising of Kurds broke out to the west of Lake Urmia, led by Smitko. But at the beginning of 1925, Reza Khan managed to suppress this uprising, having put an end to Sheikh Qajar and the Kurdish uprising. Reza Khan raised in February 1925, before the Majlis, the question of the impossibility of further cooperation with the Qajars, under pressure from the commanders of divisions. who threatened to send troops to Tehran, Article 50 of the Iranian constitution, which established, contrary to Majlis forces of the country, made a decision on the appointment of Reza Khan as the supreme commander with unlimited powers. Thus, already in February 1925, the Majlis recognized and legitimized the dictatorship of Reza Khan. After that, Reza Khan began preparations for the overthrow of the Qajar dynasty and the seizure of the Shah's throne. The Communist Party, trade unions and other workers' organizations were crushed. The Communist Party was forced to go underground. From the middle of 1925, a campaign organized at the direction of Reza Khan began in Iran to overthrow the Qajar dynasty. On October 31, 1925, the Fifth Majlis passed a decision on the overthrow of the Qajar dynasty and the transfer of temporary power to Reza Khan. The question of the final establishment of the form of power, as stated in the resolution of the Majlis, was to be decided by the Constituent Assembly. After the overthrow of the Qajars, Reza Khan, in order to attract the clergy to his side, published a declaration in which he announced that he considered his main tasks to be the implementation of the laws of Islam and the welfare of the people. The dark days when these tasks were forgotten are over for Iran, the declaration said. Further, it announced measures to protect Muslim morality, the closure of all drinking and gambling establishments, etc. This gesture did not go unanswered by part of the higher clergy. A group of mujtahids published a proclamation to the people calling for submission to the new ruler. Thus, Reza Khan, who was still supported by the landlord bourgeois circles, also managed to enlist the support of a significant part of the clergy. Measures were also taken to win over to his side those representatives of the feudal aristocracy, who did not openly fight against him. The broad masses of the people, who sympathized with the establishment of the Republic, were excluded from participation in the elections to the Constituent Assembly, which were held in an atmosphere of police and military terror. As a result, almost exclusively supporters of the proclamation of Reza Khan as Shah, landlords, merchants, clergy, were elected to the Constituent Assembly. On December 12, 1925, the Constituent Assembly declared Reza Khan the hereditary Shah of Iran under the name of Reza Shah Pahlavi. The changes in the Iranian constitution adopted by the Constituent Assembly amounted only to changing the text of Articles 36, 37, 38 and 40, which dealt with the rights of the ruling dynasty. The changes came down to the fact that instead of the Qajar dynasty, the changed articles spoke of the Pahlavi dynasty. Thus, the announcement of Reza Khan as Shah did not lead to any changes in the forms of the political system in Iran. The decision of the Constituent Assembly formalized the situation that had already existed in Iran for several years before the change of dynasty, when Reza Khan, with the assistance of the British imperialists, became the de facto dictator of Iran.